that stressing you out, Kate?
No, not at all.
Okay, just checking.
And we're live. I think I said that twice. Thursday, May 20th.
3 times a charm.
What? I mean, I can do it.
You can do it again.
And we're live. Thursday, May 20th, 2021, 5:02 p.m. Eastern Time. We are not allowed to have fun anymore. Ben has the monologue.
So I noticed about 20 minutes ago, maybe a little bit more, that a Twitter feed that had disappeared from Twitter earlier in the year is back. This Twitter feed it's a great one of the internet's one of Twitter's great eccentricities. It is the anti-Semitism cow, and the anti-Semitism cow is an account that whoever the person is, I call the account she because cows are female. Whenever she sees something anti-Semitic on Twitter, just retweets it with the word moo at various lengths, depending on how bad she thinks it is. And it's very amusing because she's funny. But one of the things that is quite lovable about it is that this gets to this point that Scott made on the show some time back, that he doesn't like the way people weaponize allegations of anti-Semitism to make it harder to engage in debates within the Jewish community and about things related to Israel. And so one of the things I've always liked about this account is that the anti-Semitism cow is actually pretty studious about not getting involved in those discussions. The stuff that she tweets is really quite simply, vile anti-Semitism, and she doesn't get into tweeting people who are criticizing Israeli policy or that sort of thing. If you say free Palestine, she's not going to moo you. But if you're really bad, you may get a moo. But not on policy stuff, not on, it's really core traditional tropes of anti-Semitism, and she's very good about it. About 4 or 5 months ago, she issued an English language tirade across many tweets, a long thread, saying she was leaving Twitter for good because Twitter had really done nothing about the accounts that she had flagged, and she noted a bunch of accounts that are really, violently anti-Semitic, and expressed a great deal of frustration that nothing had been done about these. Insisted, this proves Kate's point, that all things are content moderation at the end of the day, declared that it would have been pretty easy to do something about them, and then said she had enough and she was just leaving. And she was gone. And I, for one, missed her a great deal, both as an aggregator, as someone who was providing a genuinely useful service, and also as a great Twitter voice and eccentricity of the sort that I just like. She's a good voice. Today I discovered that she's back. She's back tweeting about Marjorie Taylor Greene. She has a long string of people talking about how mooing at people who are complaining about George Soros being responsible for whatever values they don't like. She's got some Rothschilds. She's got good stuff. So I just want to say a hearty welcome back to the anti-Semitism cow, whoever you are. Moo.
Well, this reminds me of one of my favorite jokes. Have you ever heard, yes. Anna, knock, knock?
Knock, knock.
No, you don't
Who's
say knock,
there?
Knock back to me. You're like, hold on, knock, knock.
This is your cue that I'm a foreigner. Okay.
Wow, that was amazing. You're like, knock, 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 knock. No, I was like, no, that's absolutely not how it goes. It's like a knock, knock joke. Oh man, this is gonna be terrible, but I'm gonna play it out because commitment to the bit.
Okay,
Ben,
no, I can do it. I can do it now. I can do it.
Okay, knock, knock.
Yeah. Who's there?
Moo, interrupting cow.
Oh.
Excellent.
It's like, I'm sorry. I really
That's a bad joke. I like it.
Thanks, yeah. Ben. Have you never heard interrupting cow joke? That was like one of my all-time.
I've heard a version of that, but and yet that one took me by surprise.
I just interrupting cow was like I think that Scott recently described my sense of humor as screwball. And I think that is like a very good way of putting it. And the sooner that you kind of realize that is exactly my sense of humor, and it's not like a very traditional female sense of humor. So it's like a little hard to like nail down and like identify in this context, but that is definitely what it is. And very daft, very like silly. That's like exactly right. We are not allowed to have fun anymore, but we are allowed to have Anna Bracic today to join us to talk. I know, like I practiced saying her name like 15 times before this, before we started. Even though we have been friends for a couple of years now, and friends with her partner Nicholson Price, who famously won a bow tying competition.
It's the only bow tying competition on In Lieu of Fun in the history of In Lieu of Fun, and he defeated a
head of state, a former head of state. It was amazing. I hope it goes on his resume.
Decisively, I think. Actually, it was.
It actually does appear. Yeah, it does appear on his bios now. The first time he put it on. Oh yeah, he checked it with me. And it's like, okay, this is like this impressive paragraph and all of that, and then at the end, it's the best line of the bio.
How does he word it? What does he say?
Sure. I think
we should find out.
About
we should get him back on.
Defeating a former head of state in a bow tying competition.
Excellent.
Yeah, that's pretty perfect.
Yeah.
Anna, you are an assistant professor of political science at Michigan State.
Yes.
And we are going to talk about your monograph, your book, which was, I think it was your dissertation, Breaking the Exclusion Cycle, How to Promote Cooperation Between Majority and Minority Ethnic Groups. And I am just like, but it just kind of like which I have purchased, although it is I think that it is, and it's Oxford University Press, right?
Yes.
But it is a fairly expensive like ebook, but I am going to drop it or put it into the chat because it is like a wonderful thing to peruse if you want to look at this. And this is like, but this is great. And I would love it if you could talk to us about like, I don't know actually about how you, like what your path was to being a professor in political science. I mostly know you through Nicholson and your years of long distance relationship trying to figure out the two body problem in academia. But tell us more about you.
Okay. First of all, thank you so much for having me. I would just like to say that if you at any point wish to interrupt me with Moo, please do so.
Oh, you're not anti-Semitic.
I am not the anti-Semitism cow, and you, as far as I know, are not an anti-Semite.
Not the anti-Semitism cow, the interrupting cow.
Oh, okay.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Different cow.
Yeah.
I will never do that to you.
Yeah. but you may, if you wish. I'm an enabler. You've seen how Nicholson dresses. Don't think justice. Right? Okay, but political science. All right, so I always wanted to do human rights related work. And I like data and numbers. And somehow, through a very long journey that lasted a few months past college, I figured out that, that was the space where I could do what I want to do. I think now my work sort of sits at different intersections. So I take from different literatures. So I'm not, a super pure political scientist in terms of, just engaging with that. But it's a great home to do what I do.
So how would you describe your work, like, generally? Like, what area do you write in? Like, who are you speaking to?
No, so I do mostly speak to political scientists, or more broadly social scientists. I use experiments at the micro level. Micro level, that just means that I have individuals participate in these experiments. And I combine that with a lot of field work. So it's kind of a combination of experimental work that's, data heavy, but none of the large data stuff. But then I also try and capture people's opinions and then link them to their behaviors in their experiments. So it's kind of a mixed methodsy type approach. But the way I wrote my book, at least I tried to write it in such a way that a broad audience could appreciate it and read it, right? So, mainly I speak to political scientists, but the book is written also for, people who work in activist circles, NGOs, undergraduates, anyone who would want to. I mean, there are a couple of paragraphs in there that might be a slog, but I tried very hard to write it in such a way that it would be accessible.
So tell us about the book. What are you arguing in it? What's the version of it? The sort of top line elements of it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I developed this theory of an exclusion cycle. To give a disclaimer, it's one way to describe this dynamic, right? There could be many such cycles, different cycles, and so on. But like, my theory talks about how individuals from minorities and majorities interact to make marginalization and exclusion more intractable, right? So it's, if you imagine it as sort of a ratcheting process where behaviors contribute to make exclusion more deeply entrenched. So I'm mostly talking about populations that are marginalized and how.
So which specific populations? Like, I think you talk about mostly the Roma. Is this book mostly about the Roma? Who, like, which Roma. You might have to explain who the Roma are to, like, everyone, because they go by many different terms.
Yeah. So the book is about Roma and non-Roma. And to be fair, it's more about the non-Roma than it is about the Roma, right? Because it's the people who do the excluding who play a bigger part in this cycle. But yes, just to step back a bit. So Roma is an umbrella term that people use to describe a number of different groups. They have different names. Mostly, I think people in America still know them by the ethnic slur. So if any of you have ever used the word gypped, big air quotes, this is a word, don't use it. This is your lesson, right? And you can derive the ethnic slur that I will not say from this word, right? But this is sort of actually indicative of the first part of the cycle that I described, which is anti-minority culture, right? So if you look at this culture, right, it manifests through, film, music, personal interactions in many different ways. And this word, the equivalence of which exists in many, many languages, just showed you how deeply entrenched anti-Roma culture is, right? It's so deep that we don't even understand it's a slur. Right, and so Roma populations live across the globe. Right now, they're the largest ethnic minority in Europe, about 15 million or so Roma live in Europe today. And so I use this umbrella term, even though, if we go deeper in, right, there are subgroups that we might more accurately describe depending on context and geography. So that said, the theory can apply to other groups as well. It's just that I use the case of Roma and non-Roma to develop it.
So really specifically, I want to talk about something that I observed when I was in, I wish I could pull it out, but I don't have it with me. But when I was in the south of France for a couple of years ago, for a couple of months, I remember basically people being very aware of Roma and calling people Roma and this was like just simply not an American phenomenon, because, and so like you say that this is something that people, it is so entrenched in us that we don't understand. But when we say we, are we talking, you're not, and I think you're not American by birth, and you were saying that. So there is and you're from Slovenia. Like, I think that there's this interesting, is it as true in Europe that people do not realize the entrenchment of the language and how it reinforces these minority majority interactions of exclusion as it is in like America, where certainly we've adopted those terminologies and people use the term gypped like in a sense that is not in any way meaning to be derogatory or like speak negatively of that population that it derives from, just without any awareness. So like, I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
Okay, so I will be unkind towards Europeans here, but not unkind. I mean, one might say unkind. I'm just saying honest, and it's no, of course not. In Europe, I think people are more likely to be aware that it's a slur, but they use it anyway, right? So in that space, Western Europe, but especially Eastern Europe, you might see more overt racism. We don't have the same culture of being politically correct. And so you might see things being said, sometimes people are unaware and sometimes people are aware and they're being deliberately hurtful, right? So I would say that there is probably a mix of both. There's definitely resistance among people, even when confronted, saying, this is a word that is inappropriate and hurtful, and then they'll just, hammer it on. So, but it depends. And sometimes you have people who are not prejudiced, right? It's like everywhere else, there is variation. But I would say that I observe personally a lot more overt prejudice in the European space.
My impression of that is that, in the United States, Roma communities, there are significant Roma communities, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, right, in Oregon. But I don't think of them as especially like the European Roma population. A lot of people are, sort of, it's quite distinctive, particularly in certain Eastern European countries, Romania, Hungary, whereas the Roma population in the United States is, I don't think of it as particularly ostracized or in any way separate from the communities in which they live. Is that fair, or is there more Roma exclusion in the United States? Obviously, there's a linguistic, a set of linguistic issues, but I hadn't. Is there more sort of active exclusion? I think of that as a very European thing.
Yeah, I think so. I think it is. Now, to be fair, I have to say I don't study Roma, non-Roma relations in America, right? So all of this is just speculation. My sense is, yes, that there is less Roma exclusion in particular in the United States, right? Because there are other issues here. Now, how, the Roma experience compares to, Latinx experiences in America, it's hard for me to say. I don't know. It would be a very interesting thing to look into. But the other thing, to remember is that in Eastern Europe in particular, the Roma are often the most visibly marginalized. Right? That is not to say that if they're, like, this is something that we saw, right, with, the European refugee crisis. And I have some, I have some research on this that suggests that there is anti-immigrant prejudice, obviously. Right? There's a lot of racism towards other populations. It's just that in Eastern Europe in particular, we haven't been able to observe it because there's less diversity. That said, right, I do think that anti-Roma sentiment, or at least my data show, that anti-Roma sentiment is slightly different. Right, so we may be talking about racial hierarchies here where, some foreigners who look different may be more acceptable than the local Roma population, but that again might vary depending on where you are.
And so talk.
I'm going to go look to find if I can see this this like poster that I found, which was a fourth grade, like in a fourth grade classroom in France, that was a picture in French words of a gypsy camp. Sorry, I said the word. Oh my God. So I'm sorry. I didn't mean to say that. But of a Roma camp. And I found it, and I found it so horrific that I like actually like kind of kept it. And like, anyways, it was crazy. I'm going to see if I can find it. I think it might be behind a dresser. It's completely nuts.
Okay.
So talk to us about your data, and how this fits, how the findings that your data findings fit in with the larger thesis that you're advancing about exclusion cycles.
Okay. So, let me just take you through the cycle very quickly, right? So I start with anti-Roma culture or anti-minority culture, which we already talked about, right? Then I say that this type of culture, right, enables prejudice, which then makes discrimination more likely. Discrimination happens in several spheres, like, say, employment, right? Roma are excluded from formal employment opportunities based on their ethnicity. That then leaves a smaller space for Roma to thrive, right? So they have to develop strategies. I call them survival strategies. To basically cope with this smaller set of options that they are left with given the discrimination. And so a survival strategy, if you're excluded from employment, for example, would be relying on social assistance to make ends meet, right? This is one of the bigger things that, Roma in a place like Slovenia might do, because we have a good welfare state system. And then once Roma engage in survival strategies, non-Roma will look at the strategy, they will ethnicize it, and they will attribute the strategy to the Roma as such, right? Something innate about their group, right? They will commit this attribution error. So, for example, when Roma engage in, they use social assistance to make ends meet, then non-Roma will say, oh, they do that because, they're cheaters, thieves, and takers, which takes us back to the main stereotype, right? And they will attribute that survival strategy, which actually develops because of discrimination, right? But they will attribute it to an innate quality of the group. And that will contribute to the anti-Roma culture. And so this cycle keeps going, right? So it feels like there is no escape, because however, the box shrinks of what the options are for the minority population, which then, develops ways to thrive. The majority, which is prejudice, will turn around and attribute that survival strategy to a negative trait about the group. And so,
so what are some other
exclusion becomes more deeply entrenched.
So what are some other examples of that outside of the Roma communities?
So I use this example of the Batwa or the Twa in Uganda, who are extremely excluded. So, for example, they are the original inhabitants of some of the ancestral forests, and they have been they can no longer live there, and they used to rely on foraging and hunting in those forests to survive, right? So they can no longer go back, but they're also excluded from all opportunities that exist in society outside of that environment, and so to be able to survive. Sometimes they go back to the forest to hunt and forage, and then when they're caught, sometimes they are killed. But they're often described as basically savages who are gluttonous and cannot respect the environment and so on, right? And so this is another such cycle that then continues, where the exclusion is just more deeply entrenched.
I think there are examples of this in a huge number of cultures. So in, if you think about a almost any classic stereotype in any culture, and you say, where does that come from? I think exclusion from other things is a big piece of the answer to that a lot of the time. No, I mean, I don't want to totalize it, but I know there is so somebody who knows Japanese culture well is going to correct me on this, and that's fine, because I wouldn't say making it up as I go along, but I'm, doing the next best thing, which is remembering from stuff I read a very long time ago. But there was, traditionally Japan in the pre-modern era had a four caste system, and the lowest caste, which was roughly comparable to India's untouchable caste, was only allowed to deal with corpses, and it was a sort of untouchable caste that was basically only allowed to deal with corpses, and then it became highly associated with death. Well, duh, of course, you basically restrict people to dealing with dead bodies. You will then come to associate them with death, and I think there's a lot of examples of this.
Yeah. I want to kind of just to I found this poster. I'm going to put myself on the full screen just so that I can show this for a second. This is a poster from France of, can you see?
Yes. Okay.
So this is from a school. It would be school. So you'd define words and activities, and it would be a grammar exercise. They'd point to things and be they're playing with a boat or something. And I want you to just note what the name of the scene is.
Yep.
The Bohemians, and that this is this scene in France, in Europe. I think this is this poster is from the 1950s.
Yeah.
But anyways, I just think it's kind of I know that it was a weird thing to go and root around in my closet for and find and bring up, but it just was so on point to your research. And I was it's also just this incredible moment of someone decided to manufacture these posters and put them out there and do an entire curriculum based on them, and decide that this was going to be a lecture series. And they all look very, I wouldn't say that they all actually look very happy. Well, there's a very skinny horse. They all look shabby, and they all look very they look primitive, I would say. And one is drinking heavily from a bottle that has XX on it. And then there's one making a basket, and there's lots of patched clothing, and but they're all smiling and happy. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm actually really interested in what you think that this communicates.
And just to be clear, this will be, if this is, you said this is from the 50s?
Yeah.
So this will be less than 10 years after Hitler tried to wipe out large segments of that community from within France.
Yes, exactly. Specifically. So this is this random piece of artifact that I came across in France that I was that's kind of incredible.
Did you find it in a classroom when you were there, or where did you find it?
I found it in an antique store.
Fascinating.
So that's it was they had a bunch of just they looked I don't know, someone had thrown them away, and they had a bunch of posters, and they were all there's another print on the other side, so that the teacher could flip it over and do a different type of lesson. And the other side is all about Monaco and south of France, and there's a whole scene on the south of France. But so I just think that that's also kind of a weird juxtaposition, but it was a really kind of cool it was a really cool piece. But I'm just curious, do you think that I feel it ties into your entire thesis in a way?
I mean, yes, in so many ways, right? It just not giving it any thought, and I suspect none of these lessons really involved anything that was remotely useful to actually get to know the Roma, the actual Roma, the real Roma, right? Not the stereotype. But I'm not surprised to see it. I mean, in fact, I was a couple of years ago, I was in a Slovene museum that presented our Mardi Gras traditions. And one of the Mardi Gras traditions used to be, well, I mean, we dress up in a lot of traditional wear that goes back to the pagan times. But one of the, traditional costumes is dressing up as Roma. And like the exhibit in the National Museum uses the slur to describe what's happening, right? This is not a thing of the past. I feel like a lot, and this is something that I talk about in my book too, is about how, syllabi typically don't involve anything that's helpful in terms of learning Roma history and culture, and forget about the language, right? So Roma kids who go to school in places like the places where I do my research don't really receive much education on their own history. And those are communities that have been there for 200 years, right? This is not the stereotype of, an old-timey wagon, coming to a village, setting up.
And just to be clear, because people's sense of the Roma as migratory is pretty pervasive, these are settled communities. When we say Roma, we don't mean living in caravan communities. We mean ethnically Roma, right?
Yes. That is not to say that some groups don't travel. Travelers travel, right? Travelers are not necessarily Roma. Sometimes the Roma are also travelers. Sometimes the communities are combined. Sometimes they're completely separate, right? So those are different things often. But most Roma, at least in the post-Austro-Hungarian space where I work, right, they were forcibly settled during the Austro-Hungarian times. They didn't have a choice. Right. And so the communities that I'm talking about are settled. They might migrate like anybody would migrate, but no differently than that. Yeah.
Yeah. So talk us through for a moment the difference between travelers and Roma. Travelers, I think the term means different things depending on where you are. My impression is that the British Isles communities that are called travelers are sort of some degree ethnically distinct from other Irish, but are not Roma, right? And so,
yes.
What does and there's a fairly large community of them in, I think, in Tennessee, but so what does the word traveler convey? And other than that, some of them live in caravans or used to, what is the relationship between traveler communities and Roma communities?
So I think so I'm not an expert on this, right? So this is not my area, since I work in Eastern Europe and the Balkans where the Roma are settled. But I would say there's an ethnic difference, right? So based on ethnic identity, but then also I would say the travelers are more likely to actually travel, and the Roma less, right? But I'm not willing to say that there is a clear line between those, right? Those two groups in terms of how they live. There is maybe some overlap or some mixing. But I would say that in order to be, correct and specific, like we look at, each group individually and specifically and talk about them that way, as opposed to, sort of making like a sweeping change. But I would say, first and foremost, I would say there is an ethnic identity difference, and then maybe also mode of life, though there might be some blurring there.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm really interested. So the book is breaking the exclusionary cycle.
Yeah.
Like the exclusion cycle. Like, how do we, once you are at this point in which you have such an excluded group from all of the parts of society that it's that might integrate it in some way, it almost seems like a reverse problem of how you assimilated Native Americans into to make a comparison, or any Native population into a colonizing population or a dominant population. Do we want to break the exclusionary cycle? couldn't we leave them alone and like let them be excluded as they maybe want to be at this point? Or is that a wrong way to think about it?
Okay. So these are important terms to define, right? Assimilation is a bad idea. I see the word used here more often than I see it in sort of the Roma activist space, right? This is why I use the word inclusion, because for me, even integration is a problematic term, because it often then means, oh, we will just adopt the ways of the majority, right? What we want is inclusion, right? In an ideal world, Roma would be able to be exactly who they are, but be included as equals, right? Without having to give up their culture, right? This is what we want, right? We want inclusion without assimilation, because for me, assimilation is in fact just a survival strategy, right? So you lose your culture, you learn English, you try to get rid of your accent, right?
Yeah.
I'm Slovene. Now that you can hear it. But actually, this is a very interesting thing to think about in terms of assimilation as a survival strategy. If you think about, Jews in Vienna over 100 years ago, a long time ago, right? When they were leaving traditional occupations and becoming lawyers and doctors and so on, right? Joining the professions, right? There was this process that a much better scholar than I called Verjudung, which means that, now those professions were suddenly flipped over and there was a Jewishness about them, right? So they rejected even the survival strategy of assimilation in a way, the redefining the identity that's not based on religion, because if people converted, suddenly the religious marker wasn't there, but it's an ethnic identity, right? Something
But
you can't get rid of, right?
Isn't the right answer to that people should be exactly as assimilated as they want to be?
That's true. That's totally fine.
I mean, I'm an American Jew. I am wholly assimilated in most visible respects, and that's by choice. And if I chose to be, an ultra orthodox person who was visibly, very distinct, that's within my purview of choice, and it should have no bearing on my degree of acceptance in the society. I don't see why the right answer to this isn't exactly the same. You should be able to be a Slovenian Roma, or to put a fine point on it, a Hungarian Roma, where it is really a matter of active Hungarian policy right now to exclude, and you should be able to be, living in as visibly Romani a fashion as possible, and that should not affect your rights or acceptance. Or you should be able to move to Budapest and move in next door to, the most Hungarian family and live like a, Hungarian. Like why is the answer not it's up to the individual?
Oh, no, I mean, that absolutely is the answer, right? But in order to get at that answer, you should be able to keep whatever you want without a cost. That's what I'm getting at, right? As long as it costs you something to retain whatever you want to retain, we have a problem, right? So once that doesn't have a cost, then of course, I mean, at this point, everybody should be able to do what they want. It's just that right now, that's just not the reality on the ground. And so, when I ask Roma participants what they, if they could pick anywhere to live that they want, most of them don't want to live in a settlement that's segregated for most of the town, right? They want to live in town, or sometimes they want to live on a field, and have a farm, and so these the answers are different, but most of the answers say, I do not want to live in a Roma settlement. I don't want to be segregated, right? But that doesn't mean that they don't want to be Roma. Those two things are completely different, right? But yes, I absolutely agree with you. Of course, it should be up to the individual, but we should make it so that it's not a cost if the individual decides one way as opposed to another, if that makes sense.
Zach Bliss, you are a black square, but please ask your question.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Perfect. And I want to say I'm very thankful for the existence of the TV show Big Comfy Couch, which taught me the 10-second tidy that I was able to pull off just now.
Nice.
So trying to word my question in a better way than I posed it, how do you think the portrayal of Roma populations in like pop culture, TV shows, songs, for example, impacts people's perceptions of them? I can think of some shows that like maybe reinforce negative perceptions. I don't want to say they do because I'm not like, maybe they don't, maybe they can be helpful. I'm not 100% sure. But how in your opinion do like common portrayals of the Roma populations impact people?
Great question.
Okay, this is a great question. Thank you. Okay, so I would say for the most part they're harmful. I am not a fan. Well, no, that's not true. I have not seen it. I'm sure that if I watched it, I would be a fan. But Buffy, the Vampire Slayer, that show does a good job. Apparently, there's a Roma. There's a Roma.
There's a Roma.
Yeah, and I have read scholarship that said that that's actually compared to others a pretty decent job.
They make the Roma character is a hero. Yeah.
Yeah, and they say that she's not, but I don't know, right? And in most, okay, so for example, the opera Carmen, right? The title character is a Roma woman, right? The promiscuity, the danger, the exoticism, right? Here's your stereotype: the loose woman, the dangerous, right? It's all there. Hunchback of Notre Dame, right? Esmeralda's supposed to be a Roma girl, but did you know that Victor Hugo actually had a nice little sort of gotcha moment at the very end where in fact it was Quasimodo who was Roma. It's just that the Roma didn't want the ugly baby and they stole the baby girl who was pretty, who in fact was not Roma at all in the end, right? So come on, right? So here's the stereotype of Roma stealing children, right? These things are all over the place and they're incredibly harmful, especially if it's, basically the only contact or point of contact that people have with the group, right? And so I think, we could do better.
So I want to ask you about two more recent, I guess not more recent than Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but one of them is something that a lot of people, I suspect, in the audience will have watched, is the Peaky Blinders, which is a show about British organized crime. The family is theoretically Roma, sort of settled Roma in Birmingham, I believe, in the immediate post-World War I period.
Yeah.
It has gotten some criticism I've seen for the language being Romanian, not actually Roma. But it does treat this group of people as fully formed, complex characters, and in some ways their ethnicity is incidental. I'm curious if you've seen it and if you have thoughts on it.
I also really quickly want to add to that Richard's question. So Richard, go ahead. I think that your question is more related to music, but I think that both of these can be like kind of discussed.
Oh, I guess I'm not muted any. Self-muting there for a minute. So another thing that this discussion brings to my mind, at least, is Verdi's Il Trovatore, which is also concerned with Roma. And one of the things, and so this is from 1853, and it's actually one of three operas at that time that Verdi had written that are really dealing with people on the margins. One is, Rigoletto about a hunchback, and La Traviata about a sex worker. And so But I'm just wondering to what extent what Verdi is trying to put on stage depicts maybe a relaxation, at least among some urban, possibly liberal people at this time, of these exclusionary attitudes, or was this just something to throw on the stage for for the sake of the of the local color and of the of the topic, or were there actually some real? Were people actually thinking about, oh, this is really not a good thing?
Yeah. So Peaky Blinders and Verdi, go.
This is not my expertise.
Well,
but I mean, okay. So,
but the historical question it's the historical question, really.
I have heard things about the language used in the show as well. Mm-hmm. I think, compared to other things I've seen, this is certainly much better. But I have not read, and I would love to read something by, a Roma critic to really understand what's there and what isn't. I don't think their ethnic identity is quite incidental, right? I think it plays a big enough role, for us to still see it. But I think it's at least an interesting thing to see, that they're using this this family, but then they're also juxtaposing it with other Roma communities, right? And so that shows a bit of diversity. Which I think is welcome, whether or not there are parts of the show that might still be problematic. About history and Verdi. Okay, so the thing is, I mean, come on, opera is full of stereotypes, right? I mean, just look at Puccini, right? I mean, from Toronto to Madame
Butterfly,
what do we do, right? And if you just listen to the music without any staging, without any context, right? A lot is taken, and how we think about that, I think, has to be complicated. And I would point out two things with history when it comes to Roma. So Roma, centuries ago, didn't really have a written tradition, but they have an extremely strong oral tradition. But what that means is that mainstream, white Western culture took writing that white people, mostly white men from Europe, wrote about Roma, right? And that was passed on, and that there is legitimacy to this type of writing. So what we know from history is just one side of the story. And it's a particular side of the story. And so that informs everything we know. So, right, experiences of Roma exclusion from 1853, what we know is what was written down by white men from Europe. What we don't know is, how that experience looked from the Roma side, right? So to speak of that, right, necessarily, we just know one aspect of the story. So I think we have to bring that absence into the conversation. But also when it comes to music, right, I think a lot of Eastern European music is basically Roma music.
Yeah.
If you think of, the Hungarian national music style, right, we call it Verbunkos or something like that. It was written by János Bihari. This was a Romani composer who is credited sometimes, right? But when the music plays today, I don't think anyone really understands it as Roma music. They understand it as Hungarian national style. And at the same time, right, there is much more to the story.
So I think that this is a really important point. It is the area where across Europe, from Spain straight through Eastern Europe, also in North Africa, Romani culture is most respected in its appropriation by local communities. So to go back to Carmen, what what makes a lot of the, Carmen, which is a French opera, written to sound Spanish in key places, but the inflections that make it Spanish sounding are also Romani in origin and character. There's a wonderful movie from the early 90s. It's a French movie called La Chadrome, about Romani music in North Africa and Europe. I don't know how available it is, but it is amazing how diverse that musical tradition is, and how things that you think of as regional musics are actually a migratory folk tradition across a lot of Europe.
Yeah. Is that, yes. Sorry, there's someone's mic is weird. Is that Anna?
Yeah, I think, Anna, your mic is rubbing against your
it's
shirt.
rubbing against her shirt. Okay, that's like what it is. Okay.
I'm sorry.
Oh, no, it's fine.
Okay.
Don't worry about it. Mateo. Hello, you're out in the woods. Well, we're not getting a great signal.
I don't think we can hear you.
Yeah, we can't hear you. No.
You're inaudible, Mr. Mateo Caraba. But you look great.
Still, does he look great? He's like all pixelated.
He looks good on my screen, and the trees
really?
are beautiful. Yeah.
Oh, really? That's all like kind of crazy. Oh, no, now it's coming into focus, but I still can't hear him. Nope, I still can't hear you. We're just going to keep talking about you. Goodbye.
Yeah, we're going to talk about you as though you're not there.
I will read. I will read Mateo's question for him. Mateo asks, can you talk a little bit about any relevant quantitative models of the phenomenon that you describe in your book? What was the interplay of quant and qualitative analysis on the development of your theory?
Okay, so I developed a video game. This is going to go in a direction that's perhaps somewhat unexpected. So it turns out people are not entirely honest about bias and discrimination, right? So if you ask them if they discriminate, they might lie. So what I did is I developed a video game in which people interacted, turns out with avatars, because it's a video game, and through their interactive behaviors basically revealed discriminatory, actually just discrimination. So let me just explain a bit how the game works. So there were 8 players, 7 avatars, and the study participant, and they were building a tower together. This is basically a version of the public goods game, where you get a brick, which you can either put in the tower, and that's the common pot, the common good, or you can keep for yourself. After everybody decides what to do, the common tower multiplies, it grows, and everybody gets points out of the tower, including the people who keep their bricks, right? And so this free riding maps onto the stereotype of Roma as takers. And so the idea was I wanted to see how people played this game when Roma avatars were in play versus non-Roma avatars were in play. Now, the trick of the game is that all the players that I manipulate, right? I manipulate the avatars, they behave identically. So it doesn't matter who they are, but their ethnic identifiers differ, right? So when participants were playing with Roma avatars, sometimes they contributed less to the tower and they kept their bricks because they expected the Roma to free ride, right? So this is how I captured discrimination. And it turns out that yes, right? Some non-Roma will contribute systematically less to the tower when Roma avatars are playing the game with them, as opposed to when they're playing just with their co-ethnics. So that's the discrimination part. And then for the other part, when I asked Roma to do the same thing, right? I also asked them about their personal experiences of discrimination. And it turns out that Roma who experience discrimination in their daily lives were less likely to also contribute to the tower because they expected the non-Roma avatars to discriminate against them, right? And it turns out that it only pays to keep contributing to the tower because it's an iterative game where everybody keeps cooperating or not over time with the same group. It only makes sense to contribute to the tower if others are also contributing, because otherwise you're better off just keeping the endowment that you have, the brick that you have. And so my book has nice graphs that show, averages and then regressions. And then they link that up to various factors that matter. And they basically show that Roma who experience discrimination contribute less to the tower, and that non-Roma tend to discriminate pretty seriously and contribute less to the tower when Roma avatars are in play.
Yeah, it's a very self-fulfilling prophecy. Alice Lee, you have a great question about the Roma avatars that was just mentioned. Do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I was wondering what you did to code for them, and especially when your goal isn't to reinforce these stereotypes. How do you, balance not being caricatured and also kind of getting this idea across to find out what you're testing for?
Yeah. Okay. So I had to, thank you. This is an awesome question. So I had to protect my participants, right? So no names, nothing, right? These are small places, right? So you couldn't tell even a fictitious name because first of all, it's deception and we don't do that in political science. And second of all, people had to be protected, right? So, and there is possibility of violence, verbal and physical, right? So I just used flags. I basically put the Roma flag to an avatar that was Roma and a non-Roma flag, a Slovene flag to an avatar that was non-Roma. So it was very simple. The tech is very cheap, right? Because I didn't have much money to develop this video game. And then also the game talks to participants because some Roma can't read, especially the elderly, right? And I wanted to include them in the study. So the game also has an audio component. So it would say, you're playing with 4 Roma avatars and 4 non-Roma avatars.
That's amazing. I think that's a really elegant experiment. The book sounds so, I've bought it. I am very excited. I'm going to Iceland tomorrow and I am going to bring it on my iPad and read it. And so I'm very excited. But everyone else, I put a link to Anna's book or Anna's book in the chat. See what I did there? See, I'm so bad at this. But and Anna's book in the chat, and we've been friends for a couple of years now. I'm the worst person ever. But Anna, this was such a joy. And sorry if I was weird and I dug into my closet and pulled out this old poster and everything else. And Ben's questions were so much more sensical and academic and on point. And meanwhile, I'm look at this crazy old racist poster that I found in France. Ben, you're muted.
Okay. If I can just
why don't we have an extended apology fest, Kate?
Sorry.
Anyway. No. I know. I need to move you to interrupt. In fact, there is a poster that is rumored to be somewhere in San Francisco from a Slovene school that I have been trying to track down. So I'm actually insanely jealous of you. So no, do not apologize.
It's kind of crazy. Yeah. This was a wonderful hour. Thank you so much for joining us. And
thank you.
We will be back 23. What's going on tomorrow, Ben? Are we going to be having
tomorrow? Kate will be on a flight to Iceland, and Scott and I will be talking with John McWhorter about his essay about a certain other unmentionable slur. That will be 23 hours from now exactly. And until then, Kate?
We don't have fun anymore. But in lieu of fun, we have words that we can't say, but posters that we can see, and ideas that keep being perpetuated. Anyways, thank you so much for being with us.